Recording now. And welcome. I'll get my video up here. Okay. 2 more seconds. Of course, I got the slowest computer going to do this. Ridiculous. All right, well, microphone's going, so you don't need to see my face anyways. Welcome everybody to a Free Thinkers Corner, Books and More. There we go. Okay, so here we go. So again, my name is Chris. I'm the owner of Free Thinkers Corner Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our live Meet the Author event with Michael Bruno. Just a little bit, again, if you didn't hear me, then please use the chat feature. We'll keep your microphones and videos off for the time being. Feel free to use the chat feature for your questions and or comments, and I'll relay them to Michael. And just a little bit about Mike. He was born and raised in the Lakes regions of New Hampshire. As a young boy, he rode his motorcycle around New Hampshire, stopping at all the markers that are along the highways and roadways of the state. He's a 23-year U.S. Army veteran and junior ROTC instructor. And he's now the author of Cruising New Hampshire History, a guide to New Hampshire's roadside historical markers. Thank you for joining us, Michael, and welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate the invitation to be here this evening.
It's all yours. Go right ahead.
Okay, so first I'd like to say thank you to everyone. I see my sister is on here. I don't know if you guys remember the old show Romper Room, and they had the person with the mirror, the magic mirror, but my mom's on here, my sister's on here, one of my classmates since kindergarten's on here. So great to see everybody. So this is different than what I normally do with a presentation. I have, about 15 or 16 slides that I present over a 45-minute period. But in this case, we have the question and answer part. So I'm going to give you a little backstory, kind of how I lead into my presentations that I give throughout the state, and then hopefully I can answer your questions. So Cruising New Hampshire History, how did that come about? As Chris had mentioned, that was in the forward of my book. It started probably when I was about 10 years old in 1975. I had an opportunity to go to the state capitol building to see President Gerald Ford, who was speaking on the State House steps. So I was really excited to get to see a real live president, and I also got the day off from school. So I'm going to be honest with you, it's kind of cool getting a day off from school, but I did get to see the president, and I did take a picture of him with a Kodak Instamatic 110 camera. It looked like I was pretty far away, but I think I was probably closer than I would have been in this day and age. But I thought it was pretty fascinating to see a president of the United States. My father worked for a company stocking shelves in mom and pop stores throughout the state. And in the summer, I would go to work with him on occasions. And it happened to be one of these trips. We stopped down in Bow Junction, where Interstate 89 and 93 meet, Route 3A. And we stopped there for lunch. And there was a marker, and it was commemorating Andrew Jackson's visit. And I think it was in 1833. But I read that marker and I thought, this is awesome. Not only was President Gerald Ford here last school year, but I see that Andrew Jackson came here once before too. And we had a president, the 14th president of the United States, Franklin Pierce. So this is pretty exciting. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized that all our candidates and presidents come every 4 years. So we all know New Hampshire is a famous stomping ground for presidents. But I still was intrigued with history, and particularly New Hampshire history. Then in high school, riding my motorcycle with my friends, I was actually taking a trip down to the seacoast, and we were driving down Route 4 in Northwood, and I saw the marker for Lafayette's tour, and I pulled over to look at it, and my friends continued on without me. I think they were oblivious to the fact that I had even pulled over, but I read the marker, thought it was pretty interesting, and then I eventually caught up with them. And later on, they'd asked me where I went, and I told them, and they kind of shrugged it off. But it was okay. Anytime I saw a marker, I would stop and look at it. And after college and going to the workforce, I ended up joining the Army, and I was gone for just under 24 years. And in that time, I only came home on leave, and if I saw a marker, I'd still visit. But in 2009, I retired from the Army, and my wife and I moved back to the White Mountains region, where I'm a junior ROTC instructor. My wife is also a teacher. She got her motorcycle license, so we're out riding through the White Mountains region during foliage of 2015. And it was during that ride, we saw probably 7 or 8, 9 markers, and every one of them we pulled over and looked at. And during that evening, we're sitting around the table discussing our day of riding, and she posed this question to me, and it was, "Mike, how do you know where all those markers are?" And my answer was, I don't. I mean, I know where the ones are I'm familiar with, but the rest of them are mainly happenstance. So then I was curious, there's got to be a resource out there. And at this time, I was a library trustee in my community, and I went to my director and asked for some advice if they had any books on this. And she said no. She had a pamphlet that was dated 1985. And she goes, "This is all we can find." In essence, the state had a paper copy of a marker list, and it was 30 years old. I have two pamphlets, one from 74 and 1977, and they basically have like a little pencil sketch of something about the marker and some of the verbiage. But there was nothing current. But what I did was any red-blooded American would do when they needed information. I went to Google, and during that search for New Hampshire historical markers, I found the state had a website. But when I went to it, what I found was they only had 2 PDF files, and one listed the markers numerically from the very first one in Pittsburgh to the last one that was on that list. And that list was about 2 years out of date. So even that wasn't a good resource. The other PDF file listed the markers alphabetically, which was better. I mean, if you didn't know the difference between Dover and Deerfield, it might not be that much of a help, but it was better than just going numerically. So at that time, Kristen made the comment of, well, maybe you ought to write a book, and therefore Cruising New Hampshire History. So that's how it came about. I do share something that I think is overall my overarching opinion, what I like to get when I give my presentations, and even something like this, where I don't have the visual aids to share with you, is 3 takeaways. And if there's something you can remember about the markers is you got to stop and read them. Number 1, stop to read the markers because we do pass them. I think we all probably travel by 1 or 2 on a regular basis, maybe even more, depending on how far of a commute or how far you normally travel. But we may have stopped at those ones. But if we go a little bit outside that reach, and maybe we're going to a doctor's visit or something further away, we may not stop and read the marker because we live busy lives, and we get it. But I think we'd all agree that if we stop to read the markers, we'd all be pleasantly surprised on the intriguing history that our state has for such a small state. My second takeaway is to remember that there's a backstory to every one of those markers. And what you're reading on that marker sign is basically a tagline in a newspaper, because each marker is limited to 12 to 14 lines of text. And each line is limited to 45 spaces. And it's very difficult to condense all that information onto one metal plate. And I know this, in 2018, I had actually in 2017, I had researched and submitted a proposal for a marker in my community of Frances Glessner Lee, who is known as the mother of forensic science. And in my research and editing of the narrative for the marker, I actually found like I was doing a disservice to my subject matter because I was cutting so much information out that I believed was relevant, but I couldn't put it on because of the confines of 12 to 14 lines. So understand that when you read a marker, it's just a little bit of information. And one of the things I try to capture in Cruising New Hampshire History is, yes, you can read the verbatim marker about each marker as you look on that page, but the rest of that page and a half is dedicated to the backstory. What made it more than the 12 to 14 lines of text? Those were two paramount takeaways I had from the very early concepts of the book. But the third takeaway didn't actually happen until I was traveling to the Monadnock region. And my wife and I living in the White Mountains region, the Monadnock region was probably the furthest from my home. And it's also the part of the state that I have to admit I knew the least amount. So prior to going to visit and not knowing where the markers were, and I would plot out what I could using Google Earth and use that little peg man to try to find them and cross streets, I would plot out a day's event the night before. And it was during that trip to the Monadnock region that I was planning to be very efficient in my time. And my goal was like 20 markers in one day. Because I had a 2-hour ride down, but I also had a 2-hour ride back to get back to feed my dog. And my family knows that when Duncan was hungry, Duncan had to eat. So I planned my day. I was trying to go marker to marker as quickly as I could. And it was during this trip, my wife, Kristen, advised me that I had just missed a beautiful covered bridge. And it was kind of like that light bulb moment. And I realized I need to slow down and enjoy the points between the markers. And I did. And I allowed myself an additional day or additional few hours of travel if it allowed me to visit a coffee shop or an owner of a store. I learned from the locals some of the hidden gems that they have in their community that we may not find on a map. And I try to capture those in the book as well. So my 3 takeaways is stop to read the marker, read, learn the backstory, and then finally enjoy the points between the markers. And I think that third point was, to me, the most moving for me, mainly because I knew I was going to see all the markers, but I saw so much of the state that I really took in and got a better, enhanced love for the state of New Hampshire. So those are my 3 takeaways. A little bit about the marker program. The state enacted the New Hampshire Historical Marker Program in 1955. And it was a collaborative effort between what was then known as the State Historical Commission, which is now the Division of Historical Resources, and the New Hampshire Department of Public Works, which we now know as the Department of Transportation. Those 2 departments still collaboratively manage the Historical Marker Program. In essence, citizenry and community organizations will submit marker requests to the Historical Resources Division, where the request is vetted and researched and checked for the 12 to 14 line construct, and then they'll modify the text if they believe they need to. And then once the finished product is done, they send a request for purchase to Department of Transportation, who is budgeted for the marker program through state legislation. And then they are the ones that order the markers and install them. So that's how that came about. But the RSA for the General Court enacted legislation in 1955. And it was only 3 years later when the first 4 markers were installed, with marker number 1 up in Pittsburgh, and it was the Republic of Indian Stream marker. Marker number 2 is Charleston, Fort at number 4. And marker number 3 is the birthplace of Horace Greeley. And number 4, did I say number 4? Number 3 is Horace Greeley in Amherst. And marker number 4 is the William and Mary raids in Newcastle. So that's where it started. They did a pretty good job spreading them out. They couldn't go any further east, couldn't go any further north or further west. And Amherst was somewhat centralized. And then each year, the marker program adds anywhere from 2 to 4, but generally there's about 4 markers new each year since 1958. Currently, there are 267 markers. And I think marker number 264, the first one installed in the year 2020 is there in Dover, and it's the home of John Parker Hale at the Woodman Museum. So that's pretty much about the marker, kind of like the short and sweet version of the marker program. And then I'd like to do is really open it up to any questions that folks would have.
Great, thank you. So like I said, if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the chat. For those watching on Facebook Live, feel free to use the comment section of the event, and I'll relay all your questions. So the one I have first is what qualifications are there to get a marker?
So the state's the qualifications are any person, municipal agency, organization, any group or person in the state of New Hampshire can solicit a marker of any, here we go for the noun, any person, place, or event significant in our state's history. So it's very overarching and very open based. So really, I think with the marker program, a lot of people think someone else needs to do it. But I found that, if I can use the example of this home of John Parker Hale in Dover. I did a presentation in Dover at the public library a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. I think it was in 2018. It might have been early 2019. And during that presentation, a gentleman named Paul Timmerman, who happens to be a board of director member of the Woodman Museum there in Dover, had asked me about the marker program in terms of how do you create a marker? And I said, well, and this is before the presentation started. I said, well, I'll show you all that information later on in the presentation. And I did. I had a verbatim off the state's historical resources website, the criteria. And basically, any person or event or place in our state's history and any person in our state can propose a marker. So he did, as a member, I think he's a docent of the Woodman Museum and a board of director. And he was talking about Senator John Parker Hale, which you may or may not know is there's only 3 statues of famous New Hampshire people. Yeah, Daniel Webster, John Stark, and John Parker Hale are statues on the State House grounds. And a lot of people don't know who John Parker Hale was, but he was a staunch abolitionist. So Paul shared with me that this guy needs a marker. His house is at the Woodman Museum. And what he did was he pursued it and did the work and resources and submitted a marker proposal. And it was installed in the ground, I think in April of this year, but due to restrictions for gatherings, the unveiling was in August. But I got to go down there and see it, which was a pretty big deal. Or no, I'm sorry, it was July. It was a really big deal for the community and the Woodman Museum to have a marker commemorating Senator John Parker Hale. And it was because he had an interest, he had the passion to put in the work. And I'd like to share with you the representatives from the New Hampshire Department of Historical Resources are very easy to work with. They're so used to people calling them, giving them, asking questions. I had a constituent at a presentation, a person that came to one of my presentations who emails me about their journeys. They're doing the COVID travels, and that's what they're doing during their time in COVID, is visiting all the markers. And this gentleman had just reached out to me that 2 markers are missing, and he went by the directions in my book, and I give GPS coordinates and everything. He goes, it's not there. And I said, well, I'll find out. and I literally found out, I think I found out on Friday that the markers were in police custody. So I don't know why. I'm guessing maybe they were vandalized or I don't. They just haven't handed them over to the Department of Transportation yet. But because this individual who was a marker fan recognized that they were missing, it got people asking questions and making phone calls. Priscilla, your question is, which town has the most markers? Well, I can tell you the city that has the most, and the most municipality with markers is Concord, which should be of no surprise to anybody. There are 13 markers in Concord. Most of them are in the city proper, where you could probably do a walking tour and get some serious steps on your Fitbit. But they do have some outlying markers. There's one up at the Senator Stiles Bridges house, which was the governor's mansion up on 132, and I think that's exit 15. So that's really kind of out of the city limit area. The one furthest south is the Hurricane of 1938 Turkey Pond, and that's on the Dunbarton Road. I think that's Route 13, but I'm not positive, but it's the road to Dunbarton. And the marker furthest east is up at the National Guard headquarters on Loudon Road, and it's one commemorating the mustering of all the Civil War units from New Hampshire. And the one furthest west commemorates Mary Baker Eddy, and that's up near the Concord Hospital. And I think it's now the Oddfellows senior home called the Oaks, but it's up there. But 13 of them in the city of Concord. For anyone that lives down in the Route 101 area, the area that you could get the most markers in the least amount of time is probably on Route 107 in Fremont. They have 5 of them within like 5 miles. So when I was doing that bit of the travel, it was exciting because I got 5 markers in like 20 minutes, and it was exciting because they're all on one road. And but I think they have the majority in one small spot. But I hope that answered your question, Priscilla. And there are other towns that have a good number of markers. I think Portsmouth has 4. But I think this, for small towns, Fremont has the most, followed by maybe Allenstown.
Now, is there a time, not a limit, but a amount of time that needs to pass before, say, a person can get a marker?
Do you mean like a live person having a marker?
Well, okay. Part B to the question then: can a live person get a question, or we'll just say a prominent person in a town, a legislator, or somebody, a prominent person in the state? Is there a time limit? Kind of like stamps.
Sure.
They have to wait so long before they can put a stamp out for that person. Is it the same with the markers, or?
I actually read the, of course, through time, and I'm not a lawyer or a legislator, but over time the RSA numbers change. But I read the original one, and I think it's like 248:38-B, something like that. And if you go to that one and it comes up to being like where fire hydrants are located, I apologize. But the original ones, there was a number of subchapters of how many they could afford to do, how many they're limited to where they are, because they have to be on state highways. But there's no criteria saying that a person had to have been out of office or passed away for a number of years. Because when I was reviewing for tonight some information, one of them that popped in my head was, how many markers commemorate a live person? And I knew of one right off the top of my head, and that was in Charlestown. They have the home of Carlton Fisk. And unless I wasn't watching the news, I think Carlton is alive and well, although he's probably still living in Chicago. But he has a marker commemorating, him being a, Hall of Fame baseball player, and he grew up in Charlestown. But there's 2 others of live people, and one of them is kind of a stretch, but you'll understand why. The second one was just installed in 2019, and it commemorates the creation of the basic computer language, which is when they created this user-friendly machine language, it really opened the world to non-computer scientists to program. And one of the people who was there was two people on the marker that are recognized for that creation. One of them has passed away, but the other gentleman is still alive. His name is Thomas Kurtz or Kenneth. I think it's Thomas Kurtz. He's 92 years old and he's a former Dartmouth professor. And so his name is on a marker. And I heard through the grapevine that someone asked his permission if he would allow his name to be put on the marker. The third one is kind of indirect, but it references people who are still alive. And that's in Claremont. And this is what I like to consider this one of the unique markers in our state. And it's called the Famous Handshake. And what it commemorates is back in the 90s, when Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, was Speaker of the U.S. Congress of the House of Representatives, and President Bill Clinton. And these senior citizens in this little community center sent an invitation out to Newt Gingrich and President Bill Clinton and invited them to the small town of Claremont and asked them to come out, sit down, and talk about campaign finance reform. And lo and behold, both the Speaker of the House and the President of the United States came to the sleepy little town of Claremont. They sat down at the community center and they talked about what they think they need to do to resolve the issue of campaign finance reform. And then they shook hands on an agreement, and all the major networks were there. It was a big deal. But the part that was really, I think, so unique about it, it was just some regular citizens sent out the letter inviting them. And then on top of it, they showed up. So those are the three markers commemorating people who are still alive. And they do mention Gingrich and Clinton on the marker.
What's the most interesting marker that you found? And what is the biggest, okay, that didn't tell me anything, marker?
Okay, so I'm going to go to your second question first. Because in my three takeaways, I said learn the backstory. I tell in my presentations, when my in-person or virtual video presentations with my slides and different markers, I share with them that, I have visited, now there's 267, and my disclaimer right now is marker 265 is in Cornish Flats, and it's Cornish Meeting House. Now, as a school teacher, I wanted to go visit that marker before the school year started when I had time. So I called the town hall. I think I spoke to the secretary for the select board, told her who I was, told her what I wanted is about the marker, and if she could tell me if the marker has been installed. And she goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. So in August, the marker wasn't there. But since August, the marker has been installed, and I haven't seen the Cornish Flats marker for the Cornish Meeting House. But I've visited every other marker. And there's been times I've been up at marker signs and I'm not getting the importance of, or the relevance of why that's even a marker. Because again, you're limited to 12 to 14 lines. And if I can refer back to the thought of a newspaper, if you're reading the newspaper and as you're skimming through it, what draws your attention? Is it the subject matter of an article, or is it the headline of an article? And sometimes it could be either one or both, but it doesn't mean that the ones that you pass over are any less important. And so I found that with markers, I literally would show up because my mantra was this: every time I found a marker for the first time, including my last new marker visit on October 24th, I visited the marker down in the Abbott Spalding House in Nashua and the new one at Pinkerton Academy. But don't tell anyone, because the one at Pinkerton still was covered with plastic, but I was a long ways from home, so I uncovered it so I could take a picture, but I did cover it back up. and you stop to read the marker. That was my mantra. Before I took any GPS coordinates, before I photographed it, I promised myself I would stop and read the marker. And I read both sides because sometimes they have a different message on the back. Most of them, like 98% of the time, are same message front and back. But I read the marker, and there have been a couple, and it's almost not fair to share them because that community takes a lot of pride in that marker. And then if Mike Bruno, who's a nobody, shows up and looks at it and like, well, why is that a marker? But I did share it with a person from the Brentwood Historical Society. I was invited down there for a presentation. They have They have two markers. One of them is talking about Daniel Webster's very first big speech where he spoke out against the War of 1812. And it was basically the launching pad for his career as an orator. The second one is the Crawley Falls Bridge. And it just looks like another little bridge, nothing fancy, not a covered bridge. It's just a metal bridge with asphalt crossing it, and it's not that big. So I read the marker and I'm like, I just don't get it. Why is this so important? So, I still did all my research on it. I mean, I took down the data, photos, GPS, and then I went home. And when I started doing the research for that area, the backstories, I found out that the man, Mr. Crawley, I think is his name, and I have to refer to the book to check. No, it's not. That's the name of the falls. The gentleman who created that bridge, the engineer for that bridge, it was like something with the abutments and everything, but it was a new design. And it became the standard throughout the whole state of New Hampshire. Well, he was a DOT engineer and was obviously very smart because the first thing he did after a few bridges were installed is he retired from the DOT and became a consultant so he could make more money, I'm guessing. I also found a point of that marker that I found relevant to me as an interest is he went to the Tilton school, preparatory school, and I grew up in Tilton. So I'm like, hey, this guy was a Tilton school alumni. So that was pretty interesting to see as well. But I think every time you go to a marker, everyone has their own opinion what's exciting and what may not be as exciting. But I think it's fair to say that once everyone learns a backstory, they'll get a deeper appreciation for whichever marker they may have questioned at first.
Have any of them ever been taken down for, besides the obvious that something was spelt wrong or there was wrong inference? Have any of them ever been just taken down?
So there's a marker at White Park in Concord that's missing. And that one, and there's nothing derogatory. They believe it was stolen, but it was a marker that was what they call a cooperative marker. The city of Concord or the White Park Association paid for it, and then the state manufactured it. And then the owner of the sign, which was whether it was the city or the park, never replaced it. To this, now it has been replaced. But there are markers that are considered there's issues of, I'm not saying confrontational. What's the right word I'm thinking of? I was just on a Zoom meeting 2 weeks ago with the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, and this is what we discussed. You think about the movements of Black Lives Matter and all these other things going on social justice. And if you look at some of the markers, the context of what's on there is really written from one vantage point. And I think the one, in my opinion, and again, this is just Michael Bruno's opinion, but if you travel up to Rumney, there's an old rest stop on Route 25, and there's a marker there, and it's Baker River. And it's about the river that runs down to Plymouth. And if you read the narrative is about Captain Baker and his men came upon a Indian encampment, and they slaughtered the Indians in that area. And then now, I guess it made him a hero in his right at that time. The river was named after Captain Baker, and thus now there's a marker. Well, can you only imagine from the perspective of indigenous peoples, that is a very insulting marker. So that one is top on the list. The other one that's coming up now is Hannah Dustin in Boscawen. And that marker talks about Hannah, who was, the story is back in the 1600s. She lived in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and their garrison where she lived was raided, and the Indians who took her were bringing her to Canada, where they were sold back, ransomed back, or kept up there as slaves. And there's a lot of stories about Hannah Dustin. But in essence, what had happened when they got to that part of the Merrimack River, and they were on the island where the statue is, not the marker, but where the statue is, she and a young boy who was held captive for quite a while woke up in the middle of the night, and they killed 10 of their 10 Indian captors, which sounds like an act of bravery, but they also say the records show that the majority of them were women and children. They took the scalps as evidence of what they did. They took the canoes and paddled back south to Haverhill, where she presented the scalps and received a bounty for them, and then became a heroine for that act. What I learned through the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance cohort of us that were discussing these markers is the verbiage, and I do recall this, the actual granite marker that's in place on the island has very derogatory terms etched into the stone, and it's protected by law. That I don't know if it's some preservation thing, but there's efforts that people are trying to work to remedy that. What other unique ones that are conflicting? Captain Lovell's war in Ossipee. That is the war where the white settlers is there, chased after the tribe that raided some villages, and I think that was the one where Chief Pemigewasset was slain. So Oyster River Massacre down in Durham talks about, and the Portsmouth Plains is an issue as well. One that was interesting where there was talked about a raid is also Breakfast Hill in Northampton. And that one there was a raid, and then the settlers, the white settlers actually went after the raiding party and found them in Northampton, what's called Breakfast Hill. And once they went to charge the hill, the Native American raiders actually were able to disperse, and they hid and they somehow escaped. But it was considered one of the feats where the white settlers actually fought back or chased after them. So there's a lot of them dealing with our Native American history and our white settlers. But I like what I shared with the Preservation Alliance is this. Keep in mind that at the time, English white settlers lived here. The French were in alliances with the indigenous tribes. And they were basically talking about how bad the whites were, and how if the white settlers ever came in contact with the natives, then we would just do them harm and all these other things. So, the French had a putting the finger in the pie type mindset too. So there's a lot of things dealing with our indigenous history that might be revisited. I think that they're trying to right now.
Without getting into the debate of cancel culture or monuments taken down, or is there a way for somebody who finds history is important, and the actual facts that are around that particular battle or particular moment in history or person in history, is there a way for just the general populace to a place to go to say, you know what, this verbiage is offensive, or just, is there a different way to say this, and possibly get the sign changed to continue reflecting what happened there, because it is an important event in or person in history.
Mhm.
But change it, and I don't mean soften it, I don't mean whitewash it, but change it so that it still reflects what happened without
Mhm.
whitewashing it.
So I guess if you look at every marker, and this again, I'm referring back to my meeting 3 weeks ago, whatever, with the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, and we were on there with members of two of the indigenous tribes groups. We had the Women's Heritage Group, um, and other stakeholders in our state's history. And I think we all agreed that everything needs to be placed into context without revising. So how do you do that with a marker limited to 12 to 14 lines of text? Because then you have to rewrite every marker, and then you could never have anyone agree on what those 12 to 14 lines are. One of the things we talked about, I proposed, because I worked with the North Country Council, which is part of the, like each region of our state has a economic development council. Ours is called North Country Council. And I was working with the state's Scenic Highways and Byways Commission on how we can incorporate markers in the Department of Tourism aspect. And one of the things that we talked about was QR codes. So I proposed it with another person at the meeting. I can't remember her name. I think it was Linda. I just don't remember. And she brought up the QR codes. So we don't necessarily have to rewrite markers, but we can put whatever we want on a QR code attached to the marker post. And people can learn the backstories, and that backstory could be from the perspective of the indigenous people. It can be from any stakeholders, because it doesn't have to be limited to one. So rather than rewriting it, we can add all the different perspectives, and then you as the reader have the opportunity to, collect the information and base it upon what you believe may happen, if you even think you have an interest in that. But we found that was probably the most cost-effective way, and it would allow everyone to have a voice. And that's really what we wanted to do. The couple that Paul, and I can't remember her name, I'm sorry, they were representing one of the indigenous peoples of New Hampshire alliances. And they recognized 23 markers that had some form of referencing to the indigenous people of this area, particularly Abnakis. And they said, and one of the interesting things that Paul said was, using the Pennacook marker that's at the campus of New Hampshire Technical Institute. I found that marker intriguing because it was researched and proposed by NHTI students. So immediately I was drawn to the fact that some young folks had an interest. I was moved by that. But what I learned from Paul was, I'm not against what they put on that marker. I just wish someone approached the Indigenous People Alliance of New Hampshire prior to just give us a chance to review what you have. And I thought that was a very valid point. So I think in the future, there's the Citizenry Advisory Council that I was working with, that I was part of. And then there's an advisory council or a committee at the state with all the different stakeholders. And that's what they're trying to do. Let's make it so this marker information is relevant, and it's thorough and detailed, and we don't have to rewrite every marker because signs of the times. But I think there's a value to putting the information on, say, a QR code, because it would be the most inexpensive way, as long as you know how to use QR codes. So I'm learning. I did start learning that. The other thing is apps. If there was an app associated with the marker program that could list all those things as well. I was trying to do an app for my book. The problem is, I don't even know how. The only thing I know about apps are appetizers, and that wouldn't do us much good when it came to markers. So I think there is something out there that we could do to share all those perspectives that you mentioned, Chris.
Now, do you have some of that extra history in your, well, let's start with this question first. The book, how is it laid out? Do you go by counties? Do you go alphabetically by cities? I think you mentioned something in this at the beginning, because the reference that you had when you first started was all numerical. How did you set up your book? And then Do you have some of those extra histories in the description of the marker? Part three, would you be up to doing, or have you thought of doing a second edition to incorporate, say, QR codes
Mhm.
in with each section?
So, okay. So the first part is, can you say it again? I already forgot.
Okay. First part, how did you set up your book?
Well, how it was set up. So I saw the problem with alphabetical, numerical. It just absolutely is not user friendly, and even alphabetical doesn't work. So I was trying to figure out a way to categorize the markers, and you do it by counties, but then you'd have to know which county is what. And also, you're a fourth grader that just took the test. A lot of people don't know where the counties are, or they don't know how many. Plus, that would also make my book 10 chapters instead of 7. So what I did was I took the New Hampshire Department of Tourism's 7 distinct regions from the Great North Woods, Seacoast, Monadnock region, Merrimack Valley, and I just took each of those 7 distinct regions and found the communities inside those regions because I didn't want to have to reinvent the wheel. The state already had distinct regions. And then I just alphabeticalized each of the towns that have markers per region. So if you're in the Dartmouth Lake Sunapee area, you can go and find Andover. And then you can go all the way down to, I think, Ware is in that one. So if you're in a segment of the state which has overlapping boundaries of counties, then you still alphabetical and it'd be easier to find on a map. Second part of your question was my book. Not only does it have it in the 7 distinct regions alphabetical, but the way the book is, I know you won't be able to see this, but I'm just going to open up one of the pages, and this one happened to be Gilmanton, and I have the title, the marker number, the road that it's on, the location specifically. Like this one is New Hampshire Route 107, which the state will show you. It'll say Route 107, but I add it's 3.6 miles north of Route 140, and the relative address is 1287 Province Road. So if you use a GPS, you can use it by an address, and I also have GPS coordinates. I have a picture of the marker, and then I have the verbatim 12 to 14 lines of text, italicized. So you can see if you happen not to stop to visit the marker. But then I have the text that goes on the rest of that page and onto the next page of that information of this backstory. The little bit deeper knowledge information that you would want from a marker. And then if there's anything of relevance or historical significance or just a cool place to see while you're in that area, then I try to share that as well. An interesting little tidbit was a lot of my research I did at my school resource or media center. We have a really fascinating New Hampshire history book room. And I found that some of the books that I took out probably haven't been removed from that or checked out of that library from like 1988. So I felt pretty good that if I was a couple days late on, I'd be all right. But we had a really good resource. And then I would put together my information, put it in the book. And I found that once I learned that little backstory, and you had, whether it was a book about the history or a county history, there was so much information that you could find. It was almost hard to condense it down to, a page. Because when I wrote it, my goal was 1 marker, 1 page, 8.5 by 11. The only thing is when you print, and Chris, you would know, books don't come out 8.5 by 11. Right. So I went from like 380 pages to 567. So obviously it was an editing nightmare, but I worked around it and I think it worked out okay. Your third part of your question was, there's been a lot of people asking me about, is there a second edition or something to that effect? There's 12 new markers that have been installed since I published. Now, I published on May 30th of 2018. The marker that I had submitted and had proposed was installed July 31st of that same year. And there was one in Boscawen that I think it was unveiled like less than 30 days from my publication date. So the moment I published is kind of like technology. I was going to be outdated. And I figured there'll be a point where I can get some more information. But I also think that there's a technology generation that, a book sits on a shelf, but their phone's in their hand. And that's why I've been trying to figure out a way to, mainly all the markers since the publication of my book are on my website. I put all the information there for free. Yes, someday I'll probably compile after like 5 years and maybe do a second edition. But I also joke when people ask me, are you going to do a second book? And I said, the next one will be a coloring book. And I just need someone who knows how to draw for me. So, and then we could probably sell some green crayons because that's the color that everyone would have to buy.
There you go.
And I do see that Darcy wrote down, it is Paul and Denise Pouillat. Yeah. They were fascinating folks, and they were really doing a great job as part of the alliance as well. So kudos to them. And they actually went to one of my presentations and they're like, hey, waving. And I'm like, I remember you. I just don't remember the venue because there was so many, but it's cool to see familiar faces and people passionate of history.
Yeah, we use QR codes. We have used QR codes in the past. We for special occasions like holiday books or in the summertime when the pandemic really was hitting, people were staying indoors and stuff. We would have a QR code for those that did venture outside. They could just click on that real quick, and we had a special deal for kids books, and that would just take them straight to our kids book section of our website. So they are really, really handy. Have you ever gotten lost while you were looking for a particular marker, but then end up finding other ones that you weren't expecting?
I didn't find a marker looking for a marker. I found waterfalls. I had this goal. If I was looking for a marker, remember when I was doing this back starting in the summer of 2016, the state did not have an interactive website. They still had the PDF files. So really what I had to rely on was information that was inaccurate or vague at best. And then I would have to try to figure out, well, if this is in reference to X, then it must be near X. So if I can Google X and find out its location, this marker should be close by. But sometimes I ended up going down roads, and good thing I had a truck. My cutoff point was if there was no more power lines on that road, no matter how bad the roads were, it was time to turn around. But I have to say that I did take roads. I had the mindset of, unless I come to a dead end, it's got to take me somewhere. And if it gets me back to pavement, I have a choice to go left or right, and we'll see where it takes me. And that happened a few times, and it was kind of fun. After my first day of having that in the Monadnock region, of trying to get 20 markers in that day, once Kristen said to me, slow down, you move too fast. We've all heard that song. And I wanted to kind of like enjoy the moment a little bit more. So if I went right and I should have gone left, I saw something else. And then I'd stop and ask somebody, like go to the police department. I actually had a police car trying to figure out where one of the police officers, I tried to explain the marker, and it wasn't where it was listed, was not even close. And he goes, well, there's something over there. And he tried to give me directions. And I'm like, I don't know that shows up on map. He goes, well, follow me. So I literally followed a police car, and we get out there, and it wasn't it. And he pulled over and he goes, that's not it, is it? I said, no, it's not. I said, but it's still cool. And I said, but thank you anyways. And next thing you know, we found it, on some off-beaten path. So, but it wasn't too bad. It's not like Maine where you can say, you can't get there from here, because we could get to anywhere from where we were at. So it worked out. We had the Atlantic Ocean on the east and the Connecticut River on the left, so on the west. So we're all right.
I'm willing to bet you found some really good out of the way, kind of hole in the wall restaurants too.
We did. We had some nice restaurants. I think that if I had to say my favorite find was in Winchester. And we were driving through, this is the Monadnock region, again, the part of the state that I knew the least amount. And we were driving through, and we come into the little town of Winchester, which is a sleepy, cute little town, nice big brick buildings. And it was about noon-ish, maybe 11:30, but it was close to noon. And I looked over and there was a sign that said Sweetwater Distillery. And I said, well, that's a point between markers. We should stop and enjoy it. So I did. So I stopped at this distillery in this old antique brick building that was completely refurbished, had all the rough hewn beams. And it was just Kristen, the owner, and myself. And it had samples. So we sampled the spirits that he distilled there. And then he asked if I wanted a tour. So he gave us a tour, and it was a really, really nice facility. And then we walked back out to the tasting room. I bought a bottle for my brother, my son-in-law. And in talking, I told him about the book. And the owner said to me, he goes, so you're an Army veteran? And I said, I am. He goes, well, you know who Leonard Wood is. Now, I spent almost 24 years in the Army. I have never been to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, but we called it Fort Lost in the Woods. And that's all I knew of this man named Leonard Wood. Well, he said, the guy that owned this distillery, he said, you're aware that he was born in this building? And I said, no, I wasn't aware of it. He goes, well, you should read his plaque on this and attached to the outside of the building. So I did. And I read it. And I was, one, as an Army veteran, I was embarrassed that I did not know this guy's history. And number two, as a Granite Stater, I was more embarrassed of someone with his stature that I was not aware of. In about 30 seconds or less, I can sum up his history. Leonard Wood was born in this brick building, now a distillery in Winchester, New Hampshire. He went on to college and went to Harvard Medical School and got his medical degree. He was commissioned as an officer in the Army, and he fought in the Indian Wars, and he earned the Medal of Honor in the Battle of Geronimo. As he went up in rank, he actually became, I think it was the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, what it was called, but he was the commander of the Rough Riders. And his second command was a man named Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt and Leonard Wood became good friends. Leonard Wood went on to be the personal doctor, presidential doctor for McKinley and Garfield. I don't think it's a good thing that he was a personal doctor for McKinley because he died in office. But he was also the governor, he was the Army Chief of Staff, which means he's the highest ranking person in the United States Army. He went on to be the governor of Cuba when we occupied Cuba. And when we occupied the Philippines, he was chosen to be the governor general. And he basically was the executive ruler of the Philippines while we had that as a territory. And he died in the early 1900s. But he was from New Hampshire, and I had no idea. So pretty impressive guy.
We have one of our attendants tonight is Guntis Konkara. I can never remember his name or how to pronounce his name. But anyways, he looks like he was here momentarily. He's doing a book, a historical fiction book about McKinley.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Hopefully he'll come back and listen to the rest of this so he can hear about that. So you see some of these things on the side of buildings. Are all the markers in your book, do they have a standard height, standard, all that kind of stuff? Or do you find some on the side of buildings? Are they always on the side of the road? Do they always have a standard height, standard look?
Yes, so they're all on posts. I saw one leaning up. I saw two of them leaning up against buildings, only because they were moved and they were refurbishing something or doing highway renovations, and they took the marker down and laid it up against a building. That one happened to be in Newbury. They're standard size. I'm gonna say standard. I can't tell you the dimensions. They're probably about 3 feet wide and 2.5 feet tall. They're manufactured in Ohio. I think the company is called Siwa. They are the nation's premium marker manufacturer. 26 states in the country use this manufacturer. And basically it's a metal composite. I don't know all the metals they use in it, but after they block the letters in and pour the metal, they use a powder coating, which reminds me of like Kool-Aid. It's colored dust, and they put it down and it's baked into the metal to create the markers. Some markers, just as a follow-up on that question, which made me think, sometimes you see markers that you like, oh, that's a state marker. They're not in your book. We find out that communities will put up their own markers and they'll use the New Hampshire template, and the state doesn't mind. So you'll see markers. Matter of fact, there's one in my book in Thornton, and I stopped, I did all the research, and I couldn't find it on the state's website. So I thought I had a gotcha moment. And my contact at the state says, Michael, that's not our sign. That's a private sign. I said, well, I already did the research. I'm going to throw it in the book as well. So there are a lot of markers that are out there. I want to, that, communities have. Some of them don't look like the markers that we know of in the New Hampshire Historical Marker Program. Like Hooksett has a number of markers, but theirs are blue with silver writing with their town seal. Very evident that they're not the state historical markers, but there are some that look just like the state ones because they use the state template. So they may not be in the book, and some people say, why don't you put all markers in there? I'm like, this book's already 500 and something pages. It's going to look like 3 copies of a New York City telephone book if I did, because so many communities have their own markers that it would become overwhelming. But I would share, I met a very nice lady in Barrington, New Hampshire. She came to a presentation, and she actually found some errors that I had in my book, which I have since updated because she had one of the older copies, and I updated it, did a reprint with the correct information. But she carried around a 3-ring binder, a 3-inch one, and it was stuffed. And that's what she does. She just goes around and drives and finds monuments and markers, and she has them all laid out. Like, I was so impressed. I did a presentation in Epsom, and I invited her to come in because I wanted a picture with her book. So she had this giant, 3-ring binder just filled with, all kinds of memorabilia of New Hampshire markers. It was really cool. So I learned a lot from the people that go to the presentations.
Have you ever found a spelling error or a date error where it should have been 48 instead of 84, something like that?
I found errors. A lot of them, I don't know if it's a spelling error. It might have been considered factual back when the marker, the terminology or the grammar would have been in place. But I do know there's errors on markers. The one that I share is up here in my area, and it's for the Crawford House in Carroll. And on the marker, and I don't remember verbatim, but it talks about the Crawford family starting the home, and Ebenezer had it, and his son went on to have it. And it says the current house has been standing since like 1872. Well, that house that was standing in 1872 burned down in 1978. But the marker was installed in 1976. So in 1976, that was an accurate marker. 2 years later, the house burnt down, the Crawford House, and now it's the Appalachian Mountain Club's Highland Center. But the marker still says this one's been standing since the 1870s. Like, no, it hasn't. It's only like 15 years old. So there's some of those. Like, I had a person at my presentation last week ask me this one, and I never caught on. So it was really a good little trivia question. The marker for the Cog Railway lists the height of Mount Washington as 6,293, not 6,288. So the marker is showing that the mountain is 5 feet taller. So maybe whoever was taking the measurement stood there like this, and he was at the 5 foot mark, and he added 5. Or maybe you're standing on a snowbank, and I don't know. But the marker actually has the incorrect elevation of Mount Washington.
Wow. Wow.
Mm-hmm. I just learned that last week.
That's cool. What's the ratio of representation of we talked about this before we went live. You had this similar question. persons versus places, and then persons versus men versus women versus persons of color. That's what did you find some sort of ratio or
So when I proposed my marker for Francis Glessner Lee in Bethlehem, when I first sent it to the state, my contact, who is a awesome lady, she's really good to work with, and she was, Mike, I really like your marker. I want to see this one get in as soon as possible. And I said, oh, great, that's awesome. She goes, well, it's because it's about a 20th century woman. I normally get markers of dead Revolutionary War generals. And I couldn't help myself, being a dad, I had to throw a dad joke out. And I said, well, aren't all the Revolutionary War generals dead? And she's like, ha, ha, ha. But the markers, and I didn't even add the one for Francis Glessner Lee, but the markers that I have right now, there are 9 markers commemorating a women out of 267. So for our math folks out there, they can say it's quite low. It's probably like 0.03. A very low percentage of women are listed on markers. But the stories that they have are really good ones too. So, is it an imbalance? Probably. But if you think the marker program began in 1958 with the first markers, and it took a while. The one I saw in New Hampshire Chronicle, and I apologize to the audience if I can't remember her name, Fritz Weatherby talked about her. And then I had a lady from, she's the president of the Friends of the National Public Library, bring up this lady from the Seacoast, and I think it's Dover. She was the first woman to run for governor, and she would vote illegally because she was an attorney. And she, even though I think when she graduated from past the bar, she had one of the highest scores, but no one would take her serious because she was a woman. And I can't remember her name. So if anyone knows it, if they could put it on the chat, I think that is a New Hampshire native a woman who needs to have a marker, just needs someone to do it. And I apologize, I can't remember her name, but she was definitely one that would be worthwhile of a marker. We have a name.
Ricker?
Yes, Ricker. It's Ricker. Yes. When I heard her story, I'm like, that's fascinating. And she had, because of the women's suffrage movement, she didn't have a right to vote. So, but she ran for governor and she'd vote illegally. So I thought I think I liked her sass. She had some moxie. So that was good. I like that story. And I hope that someone pursues the story of Miss Ricker and gets her a marker in the future. Now, just to let folks know, because I found out maybe a couple months ago, and I think it's all COVID driven, but this is going to be the first year since 1958 that there are no markers getting installed on state funds. So, if a community wanted to fund the marker, it's like $2,200, $2,400, the state would still pursue getting one manufactured and installed, but they won't be funding it this year, unfortunately. And if you go to the New Hampshire Historical Marker website under the Historical Resources Division, they have it in bold letters right across the top in red that they're not funding any markers in 2021, which is unfortunate. So I did have a person that I shared that with, and like, good, that'll give me a chance to catch up. It's only 4 markers. So, but I got to share again, I've had, since the pandemic, I went last year, I had 80 presentations statewide. And this year I probably had 5 or 6, including this one. It changed the dynamics of how we go out and visit and see people. But what I found was that some folks who don't get out had an opportunity to go to a presentation. So maybe in the future, our in-person ones need to be all Facebook Live or Zoomed as well for those people who can't get out. I had a couple reach out to me totally unsolicited, and I read my email, and they said, oh, with this COVID thing, we need something to do. We can either we can either buy a camper or get a convertible. So they chose to get a convertible, Mazda Miata, and they traveled the state with their little picnic lunch. Like every few days, they go out and hit up an area, and they saw the whole state and got all the markers in like 4 months. So it took me a couple years, but I wasn't trying to do it every day. But I was so impressed because they shared with me the points that they were shared in the email was there's a lot of places near my home that I wasn't even familiar with, right, because I left the confines of where I normally travel. I went on roads that I would not have normally gone on, but now that I'm looking for markers, I'm going to new areas. And then the other thing was she shared, I had a lot of things come back to me that I learned when I was in elementary school in New Hampshire history in that curriculum. So they really enjoyed and appreciated the company and going out to just see the markers. And I wanted to meet up with them and, buy them lunch or something, but they already hit up the White Mountains region. But I really enjoyed all the correspondence I received from patrons and people reading the book. I had a mom down in, I think in Portsmouth or Hampton, grandma. She actually goes out and does a scavenger hunt with her grandchildren. And that's one of the things they do because it's free. And just in the early part of, if all of us remember, when school was still in session last spring, we're all trying to figure out how to navigate this new world we're in. And I had a local lady in our town who we're friends with. They're much younger than us. And she said, do you mind if I come by and get one of your books? You could just leave it on the porch. I'll come and get it. I need to get my boys out. The weather's getting nice. And it was like late April, early May. And they did. So they picked some time and they did all the markers in the Great North Woods. They took pictures of her boys. They're like, I think like 5th grade and 3rd grade or 4th and 2nd, but they're young, primaries. And they went to all the markers, had their picture taken, and she shared them with me. So I was already moved by the fact she shared with me those pictures. But they went on a vacation this summer to like York Beach or something. And as they're coming back, they're going through the Seacoast region. And one of the little boys goes, look, there's another one of Mr. Bruno's signs. So now I feel good that I own these signs in his eyes. So that was pretty cool. It goes back to remembering my days when I was like 10 years old and taking an interest in the markers.
So has this COVID thing hampered your going out and researching more, or are you still just going out and looking at more markers? And
yeah, so 4 new markers this year. Of course, you're at the mercy of when the state will install them. And as I mentioned, the Dover marker for John Parker Hale's house at the Woodman Museum, they actually had it in the ground in March, but they didn't do an event until July because of the restrictions of having gatherings of like 6 or more. And they didn't want to, that was the first one unveiled in the state. And the commissioner for the Division of Natural and Cultural Resources were there. 2 members of the Historical Resources were there. There was a state senator. There was some people from the press and the Woodman Museum. It was a big deal for Dover. And I was, proud and, humbled to be invited. It was really a cool opportunity to see a new marker going out. And Nashua just had theirs on October 24th. Their unveiling was at 10 in the morning. I'm like, that means I have to leave my house at like 7:30, and it's a Saturday morning. And I got there at like 11. They're already dispersed, but I got to see the marker all for myself. And it was a beautiful day. There was still colors on the trees, a little bit of oak, had some oranges and yellow. And it was really pretty. So I still go out anytime there's a new marker, and I try to keep up to date. The lady, my contact at the state, does a good job on letting me know, the statuses of them. And likely when I get information from markers, I share it with her as well. So if there's something I can share with the folks on this evening is when it comes to markers, they rely on the citizenry of New Hampshire for, if you notice one is missing or damaged or something's not right, they don't know in the office. So they they appreciate calls to be kept up to date. So just something to keep in mind.
Well, hopefully in 2022, things will be as back to normal as they can be,
Yeah,
and you're going to be busy.
I hope so. I hope
Have you
so.
thought of do any other states have historical markers like this? And have you thought of going to Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts
Hmm.
to do another research project like this?
So we have 267 markers. I think Vermont has somewhere in between 260 and 270. They're very much on par with us. And their markers, if you see them, they're impressive. They're gold lettering on a green marker. What I find about the Vermont markers are they're not as significant of an event. And New Hampshire's markers require them to be, significant in our state's history. And I find that some of the markers in Vermont might be more regionalized. An example was I was driving past Danville, heading up to Morristown, and I saw a marker for like this guy named John Brown, and he was a blacksmith. And I literally pulled my motorcycle over. I'm looking at it. And I'm like, well, I guess if I'm related to him, that's pretty impressive. But to an outsider, it doesn't really mean much. Maybe I need to know the backstory, but it didn't seem to have the relevance for the whole state. It seemed more localized. Interestingly, one of my former colleagues that I worked with in the military lives in Vermont, and he got my book. He actually was driving from Maine to Vermont. He was going through Jefferson, and he saw one of the marquee signs out for one of my presentations, and he reached out to me, and we hadn't connected in over 20 years. And so once we reconnected, he's like, I love history. I'd love to do what you did in Vermont. And I said, well, I'd be happy to help you. And he goes, but I think I'd like to do video. And I was like, well, I don't know how much help I will do on that, but I would be happy to go around with you and maybe help you design it. So it was an idea. But I never thought of myself. It's never been on a bucket list to be an author, and I still don't even consider myself. I think I'm the purveyor of a book, but I don't consider myself an author. So I don't have that itch to move on to the next book. But you know what? If it strikes me, I would do that. For Maine, I don't know what they have. I never researched what they have. And I know Massachusetts has an abundance of markers.
Have you ever found a personal connection with any of the markers, such as a relation to one of the people, or a distant relative or distant ancestor in that particular situation that the marker presents?
Yeah, I can't trace any lineage to any of our famous history, regrettably. But I took a lot of pride in, I grew up in Tilton, and Tilton has, there's a marker there in Lockmere, which is part of Tilton. It's called the Lockmere Archaeological District. And up until 2017, that was listed as Belmont. And when I started doing my research, I contacted my person at the state, and I said, you realize that marker is not in Belmont, it's in Tilton. It's on the Tilton side of the Winnipesaukee River. So she corrected it and basically removed one of two markers in Belmont. So Tilton had one, and Belmont went from 2 to 1. And I jokingly would comment that I never got an invitation to speak in Belmont. But Tilton now has 2. They just put one in 2019 called the Charles Tilton Legacy, and it talks about Mr. Tilton and his family legacy and their influence on the town with all the statues, and making Tilton what it was famous for was, how beautiful it was, like a little Roman city with all the statues. And I know that the Tilton Historical Society is working diligently to bring back the history to the citizens of the town. So that's as close as I have as a connection.
Did you take the pictures yourself, or did you get
Every
that
one
call?
but one. Every picture of a marker is mine, with the exception of White's Park. And I actually credited in there, I think I got off Pinterest, because that marker was missing since 2010. And I couldn't find one anywhere. I actually talked to the the people at the city park, and they didn't know anything about it. So I just started researching, and lo and behold, I found a sign from 2010 on like Pinterest or something, or so I put it in there because, to have the marker picture, and that's all I had. But all the other ones are mine, including the cover, and they're all done with my phone. Of course, you had to Photoshop a little bit, make the sky a little prettier, but it's all done with my phone.
Nice. Have you ever thought of doing statues?
Oh, no, I haven't. I'm sure, you know, there's an item out there for everyone that someone could do. I met a lady in Warner at a bookstore there, and she says, I visited all town pounds in the state of New Hampshire and like half of Massachusetts or whatever. And I only thought I found like 5 in New Hampshire. She goes, no, there's like, she rattled off this number. And I said, did you do the research on it? She goes, no, but I got a picture of every one of them. And my first thought was, wouldn't that make a cool coffee table book? You just if you got nice photos of all these town pounds, and maybe start off with a little history of what a town pound is and why did towns even have them in the first place? You don't have to do the history of each one because there may not be a lot of variation, but that's a book like, the islands of Winnipesaukee. There's a book out there on all the islands. Why couldn't there be a book about all the town pounds in New Hampshire? And that lady has all the resources. I really told her she should do it, and I don't think she had. But statues, no, I never even thought about that.
So I'd like to go back to talking about the book and your writing process. For those of authors who may be watching us or watch us later, so I noticed that you are traditionally published. So one of the things I like to talk about is what made you decide to go traditionally publishing your book instead of self-publishing? Because self-publishing is a huge thing right now. There's a lot of platforms out there, one that shall not be named on our website or Facebook page. So why'd you go the traditional publishing route?
So you ready for the deep dark secret?
Go ahead.
Didn't. I'm self-published.
Oh, okay.
The Lloyd's Hill Publishing is me, and they have a bestseller, but they only have one book. It's me. Yeah. I just thought, you know what? Let's have a publisher's name. I had an opportunity to put one on. I didn't LLC it or anything like that. My cousin who lives in Florida is writing a book, and he says, could I publish under your name, like under Lloyd's Hill Publishing? I'm like, if you want. I'm not asking for royalties. If you want to put the name down, I don't care. But I think I did it more just so I could categorize that as something separate than, when I do my taxes, I had something separate. But I self-published, and I have to say, it was you have to be dedicated to want to do that. And I don't know if my dedication was I wasn't willing to fork out the money, but it wasn't that. It was. I didn't want to fork out the money to pay for a publisher, but I also wanted it my way. I knew in my head what I wanted to do, and I didn't want anyone to change my mind, even if it meant a detriment to the end product. And as an example, and I know you can't see this, but the copies that you have, Chris, in the store, it's got a shiny gloss. And I had a choice between this or a matte, same picture. So what I did was I took it to my school, and I asked, I think it was 10 teachers, and then my wife and I. And I had a matted copy and I had a glossy. And I asked everyone to choose which one did they like better. Do you want to take a guess what the vote was? It was a split.
Wow.
It was a 5-5 split. So I had my preference. So I went to my wife, Kristen, and asked her what she wanted. And she was the opposite of me. So in the end, it was a 6-6 tie. But since it's my book, I broke the tie. And I went with the glossy, and I don't regret it, but it was a learning experience. And I think that if someone had like a fiction book I would encourage them to maybe go through there was a young lady that I had in my advisory group in my school. And I shared this with one of the publisher that was at your book event in March. And she wrote this book that was a blend between Lord of the Rings and Star Trek and like 5 different things. And it was fantasy and science fiction. And it's none of the genres were my choice. But I read her whole manuscript and I was like, how did you do this? It was phenomenal. And I asked her, you really need to publish this. And in her case, I think that she could have she could have published on her own, but you had to have it, and being in this business, you have to have something that draws the person's attention. And it's not necessarily the title, but a lot of times it's the picture. And she drew this like artwork, which she's not an artist, of the characters for her artwork. And I said, why did you do that? She goes, well, it's about these 5 children. And my comment to her was, why did you put faces on them when you described them so well in your book? Now you changed my image of what these characters look like. Why don't you have a picture of like some cedar trees with the fog rolling through? Because it's mystical. And so she's working on something like that. And I hope she publishes, because it's going to be a phenomenal book. Nice. So I think, it depends on, and I looked at the traditional route and I looked at self-publishing. And I think what it came down to was I couldn't find a traditional publisher, not having ever done this before and spoken to writers, someone that I could trust and feel comfortable with. But I did after the fact. And I spoke to a New Hampshire author who's written a ton of books, and I know you're aware of him because you've corresponded with him, Dan. And he shot me towards his publisher, and he goes, Mike, you got to go this route. I'm like, why? I've done all the work. Why would I? I did it. So, it's one of those trials by fire, and I just happened to do okay.
Do you think it would have been easier with marketing your book and distribution of your book going with a traditional publisher versus doing it yourself?
Absolutely.
What was the hardest part? What has been the hardest part of trying to market and distribute your book?
So if you keep it in the context of one, I never considered myself an author. So whether I sold 100 copies or 1,000 copies, it didn't matter. So that was my mindset. I never had I actually did have a goal. I'd like to sell 100. And I mean, it was well past that. So I think the marketing that I did was, I went to my local library, who I was a former director of, a trustee, and I said, I'd like to give a presentation in this community, and I want to sell my books. I won't charge you a fee. I just want to sell the books at this presentation, and I'm going to donate my proceeds of my profits to the Historical Society and the library. Of course, they said yes. And then I wanted to do it for my hometown library in Tilton. Same thing. And I was doing it as a fundraiser for children, backpack for kids. It's called Every Child Is Ours. And I did it there. It was very successful. And it was never about the money. As long as I didn't lose money, I was good. And I found that using it as a way of philanthropy was awesome. I really found a lot of joy. It's like, hey, I'm not losing money, and I get to help others with using my book, and people enjoy the book. That was my driving force. But marketing, it was libraries. The libraries in their listservs shared my name throughout. And to be honest with you, I never had to solicit any venues. So
well, we owe a big thanks to New Hampshire Chronicle, which that episode can be viewed on your website. Yes. For bringing you to our attention. Mm-hmm. We're big fans of New Hampshire Chronicle, and we saw the thing with your about you and your book, and I wrote it down right away on my phone, and then I think I got in touch with you shortly after that.
Yes, you did.
So who do you use for editors? How important is editing? who designed your cover? I know you said you took your pictures of
Mhm.
what's on the cover. Who designed all that? Was that you, or do you have friends and family?
It was me. I also, like I had English humanities teachers at school review my manuscripts because I could read it 5 times and I'd still miss the same error. I just needed different eyes. And what I found was I would go to the teachers and say, "Would you be interested?" And they all said, "I'd love to read over your manuscript." And I said, "I'm willing to pay you for it." "No, no, no, we don't want any money." Well, the cost of that is time because now they're not apt to get it done in the time that I wanted it. But it's okay because I wasn't really pushed to get it at a certain time, like if I had a publisher deadline. And the artwork, that was one of my pictures I thought was so iconic of New Hampshire with the Mount Washington Hotel. It just happened to be a good day. I took it from all kinds of vantage points on a number of days. I mean, I live 10 miles away from that marker. So I could go when, there was um, bluebird sky days. And I actually had a person at my school who was our digital media person who knew how to use Adobe Photoshop. So he could like move lines and try different shades of colors on a palette, which I had no idea. And all it cost me was a signed copy of my book. So it was great. It was a community that helped me to do it.
I'm very computer illiterate as far as when it comes to designing and graphic designing and things like that. I do have one program that we use for our stuff, and so when I was designing the um, picture for the promo for this event, I'm like, yeah, I don't like that, I don't like that, but and then I saw the picture of your book, your cover. I'm like, okay, I got to use that because it was just perfect. It had you, it had your book, it had the sign, it had the
Mhm.
background in it, and it was perfect. So it's great, great cover. Um, One of the questions I like to ask too is for fiction writers or even nonfiction writers, if they ever thought of turning their books into an ebook or audiobook. Well,
Mhm.
in your case here, it'd be a little tough,
Yes.
probably for an audiobook, maybe an ebook with like a downloadable PDF or something of all the
Mhm.
pictures and things. And then I also asked too, if they ever thought about having their books made into a TV series or a movie. Of course, yours wouldn't be that; it would be more of a
Mhm.
documentary. Have you ever thought of having your book turned into a documentary?
Um, that would be really cool. Well, I do have something in the works. I say I have it in the works. I don't. It was proposed to me by New Hampshire Public Television. And if you notice that they have, before they have an episode, they'll have, of course, they have like Our Town, well, with Rebecca Rule. Well, what New Hampshire Public Television did was they reached out to me through the person who I was printing through, which is in New Hampshire, and he referred me to the president of New Hampshire Public Television, who met with me when he was up in the White Mountains region, and he said, "We would like to do something with your book." Now, I was ecstatic. So what they're trying to do is do snippets. So let's say they're going to go visit and do a segment on Dover, and they're going to do. So I have a partnership with them. So what they'll do, right now they're waiting for corporate sponsorship, but what they're going to do is they'll see the markers and the 4 markers in Dover and do little snippets of each one of them and incorporate on both sides of the episode of Our Town. So if they're going to be in your community and there's markers in your community, they'll do a little snippet kind of from my book with some narration of the history and before and the after of the actual segment of the program. So right now they're waiting for corporate sponsorship on that. But if that happens, that'd be really kind of cool because they said I'm a producer. I'm like, I didn't really produce anything, but it's still kind of neat. So
Would did they ask you if you would do the narration of that, or did they have somebody in mind?
they're going to, yeah. So I didn't get. I guess I don't have the golden voice, but they said there's an additional fee that they would have to pay to have, me come in and do the voice parts and the practices and stuff. They're going to basically give me production rights as the ownership of the book and share, um, you know, information from the book and referencing the book but they're going to have, and I'll use this as an example. Rebecca Rule would do it for her segment, or someone that works at New Hampshire Public Television, but it wouldn't be me. So no, I'm not going to be the next Fritz Weatherby.
Yeah, well, speaking of celebrities, if you had the option to pick anybody, be it local, national, TV, movie, voiceover actor, like those that do audiobooks, if you know any one of them, who would you choose to narrate your portion?
Gosh, I'd like to say General John Stark, but I don't think he's available. I don't know.
And unfortunately, Sean Connery's
Everyone
not
loves
around
Morgan
anymore.
Freeman, but
Like James Earl Jones, or
sure, yeah.
That's just a fun question I like to ask.
Yeah.
So you do have, I believe you have a second book in the works. Am I correct?
In concept only.
Concept only. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, we're coming to the end of our time, unfortunately, because it can go on for a long time here. This is just fascinating. But one thing I do like to ask too is, what is your favorite book to read? Are you reading anything in particular now? Do you like this type of historical thing? Is that what you typically read, or what is a guilty pleasure read for you?
So I love to read fiction. I also love to read nonfiction. So there's kind of not giving you much specifics, but the most recent book I read was the biography of Charles M. Schulz. And I think I have some classmates and family members online that know I'm a big Charlie Brown fan. So
everybody loves Snoopy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'd like to thank you again. I want a quick shout out again to New Hampshire Chronicle for bringing you to our attention. It's a fascinating book. It is available in our store, Freethinkers Corner. It's available through our website as well, freethinkerscorner.com. And it's also available through bookshop.org, which is a direct competitor to that other online mega store that shall not be named. But so an alternative is bookshop.org. They support local bookstores. We partner with them. We get a portion of the sales. So your book is available through them as well. If there are no other questions from anybody in the audience, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Again, thank you very much, Michael, and we're hoping to have you in the store here soon.
Yes, thank you. And the copies that are in Chris's store are already signed.
Yeah, and we don't worry, we won't run out. As soon as we get down to the last one, we'll make sure we get to you to bring us some more.
Perfect.
All right. Well, everybody, again, thank you for joining us. And Michael, thanks again. And everybody have a good night.
Thank you.